Hey everybody, and thank you so much for having me today and allowing me to deliver this session. The session today we're going to be talking about delivering your data center migration project successfully. Now, my name is Sarah Lean and I'm a Senior Cloud Advocate at Microsoft. I'm based in Scotland, as you may be able to tell from the accent. I've been in the IT industry for more years than I care to remember, and I come from the IT pro or sysadmin side of the IT environment and IT world. And that's where I tackle a lot of my projects from. Please do reach out to me on social media. My Twitter handle is TechieLass, and you can find my blog at techieLass.com. Now, we are seeing a lot of customers migrating or thinking about moving some of their workloads up into Azure from that on-premises data center that they have. And that's for a number of reasons. Unfortunately, there isn't a day goes by where we don't see a kind of data breach or some kind of cybersecurity incident. And that's playing on a lot of organisations' minds. They're looking at how they can try and offload some of that responsibility or be more secure in their environment. And that's why they're looking to Azure. They're looking to Azure because Microsoft invests well over $1 billion every year to look at cybersecurity. I think we have over 3,000 security experts within the company, probably a lot more, to deal with some of this and to try and think about what's happening and plan for the future. So a lot of companies are looking to invest in Azure purely from that cybersecurity point of view and try and leverage the big name that Microsoft have in terms of security. Other things, such as their data center is starting to age, it's starting to become, burdensome, it's old, it's legacy, if you want to say that. And traditionally we've all invested every 3 or 5 years potentially in new hardware for our data centers, and lots of companies are coming to the end of life for those data centers and starting to think about whether it's worth the investment going forward or whether it's time to actually think out the box and go for something new. However, regardless of your motivation or your industry or your company size, when you embark on one of these migration projects, there are a bunch of stages that you need to go through. And that's what we want to focus on today. We want to focus on those migration stages. Now, when I talk about migration stages, I talk about discovery, assessment, migrate, and secure and manage. And as we'll walk through these stages, you'll find out that it's not just the technology that we're focusing on. The success of your project also hinges very much on the people within your environment as well. People within your IT department and the end users. So let's have a look at each of these stages and think about the things that you need to think about when you are embarking on this migration project. Now, the discovery phase is the first stage of the project, and arguably I say this is the most important one, because if you get this right, then chances are your migration project is going to be a lot more successful. The discovery phase is all about understanding what's happening within your IT department and your organisation. Now, some people say, should I do the migration strategy or should I do the discovery first? I'm at that thinking that the discovery phase is the most important one, so you do that one first. And this is where you actually start to look at what your servers are doing. You start to understand what servers you have within your environment. You have to look at what workloads you have, how these workloads all interconnect to each other, because let's face it, our servers, our applications, our workloads do not work in silo. They all connect somehow, even if that's just back to, for example, your Active Directory. You just look back and connect to that, and there's that authentication method that's happening with the servers. What you really want to do is start to discover those dependencies and discover what's in your environment, because as much as I think we like to think that we know everything that's in our environment, there's probably something that's been snuck in there that isn't documented and we aren't aware of, and we need to be aware of when we actually try to migrate it, because the last thing you want to do is have workloads all spread across an on-prem environment and a cloud environment, and there's latency issues and it doesn't work right. So you need to make sure that you're grouping things together, and you need to do that discovery and so you understand fully what that is and how that hangs together. Now, you're also starting to look at the people within your environment, understanding what's happening from an IT department point of view. the cloud is very similar to your on-prem environment, but it's also very different at the same time, and you need to make sure that your staff are aware of how to operate, how to work the cloud, and are familiar enough with the cloud to be able to support what's happening within your workloads when you move them to the cloud. So you need to look at staff training. How advanced are your training? How advanced are your staff in terms of using the cloud? Do they need some assistance? Do you actually need to invest in sending them on courses or providing them with training environments? What is it you need to do to make sure that your IT department are prepared for this potential project as well? You should also use this as a touching point for your end users, your business stakeholders, and try and speak to them about how they operate within the IT department. So we provide in an IT department lots of systems, lots of workloads for other departments, whether that be the HR system, whether that be the manufacturing tools to log faults or whatever. There's something that we provide. We provide services as an IT department to the rest of the organisation, and we need to understand how they interact with these services and how a potential cloud move would impact them. This is the time to ask them things like, do they actually enjoy the system that they're using? Are they maybe potentially looking at their own projects to replace that system and haven't involved in the IT department? This is your time to start to, get back involved with them and speak to them about what's happening. Start to understand their dependencies. What is the criticality of these workloads? It might be that it's always been labelled as P1, most critical, has to be up 365 days a year, no outages, uptime of 100%. But is that true? Is that actually true of what's happening within the department? And ask those questions. Ask the questions to reevaluate what's happening with these applications and the criticality so that you can plan accordingly. Because if something is mission critical and you aren't aware of it because legacy documentation has said that it isn't mission critical, you put it into the cloud and something happens and it's not available, chances are you're not going to have a great reputation within your organisation. And vice versa, if you spend a lot of money architecting something in the cloud as highly available and it's not required within the organisation, then again you're not going to be the most popular with your boss, etc. So there's lots of things you should be thinking about. This is also a point in time where you can start to look at the cost of your environment. Lots of people look towards moving to the cloud to save some money, but they aren't fully aware if they actually can save any money when they architect within the cloud because they don't understand their existing environment costs. So this is a great time to try and look into those costs and try and find out how much your current environment costs. This can be hard for a lot of organisations because they don't see the true cost sometimes of their data centre, because the data centre is part of the office block where the rest of the staff sit. So you don't see those electricity or security costs built into the data centre because they're carried up into the all over budget for the organisation and not siloed within the IT department. So have a look, really understand the existing environment cost, because when you pay for something within the cloud, you are paying for that electricity, you are paying for that security, that hardware maintenance on top of all of that. So you need to make sure you're comparing apples with apples and not comparing something where your existing cost says that a virtual machine is £4 a day to run, but you've not included the electricity cost, you've not included hardware maintenance, you've not included security, etc., etc. Because if you try and compare that with a virtual machine within Azure, you're not going to get a good comparison because you're not comparing the right costs together. So discovery phase is massively important. So as I said, as part of the discovery phase, you want to look at what your servers are doing, what everything is connected with. Now, I'm not asking you to go out with a paper and pen and do this. There are tools available to help you discover that data, to help you fundamentally do all of that data collection and collate it for you in a good way of reporting it. Now, there are, like I said, tools out there, but you need to understand what these tools do and how they interact with your environment. There are some tools out there that are free for use and you can use them and there's no cost to them at all. There are tools out there that are chargeable per virtual machine that you're scanning or per server that you're scanning, per report that you generate. There's all different types of costs. There are also different types of how these applications and these tools interact with your environment. Some require you to install an agent across all of your servers. Some require ports to be open across your environments to do the scanning. Some store the information up into a cloud. Some store it locally. You have to evaluate each of these tools to understand which one meets your requirements. Can you actually go out and install an agent on every server? Would that be okay? Would it be easier maybe to look at opening up some ports across your network? How are your security team set up for actually starting to store data in the cloud? Have they approved that? How would they take that conversation? Understand what information is actually being passed up into the cloud. Sometimes it's just server names, IP addresses, the operating system that the server's running. So there's minimum data that's being shared with it. But is your security team, is your organization mature enough to understand what that means and why you're going to do that? So you need to look at these tools and understand how it would impact your environment and which one is the easier one for your environment to actually implement. Now, the second stage is the assessment stage. This is where you start to strategize your migration. Because you've collected all of that information about your environment, you've got a lot of the information that you can start to answer some of these questions. You can start to answer the questions about what workloads are actually migrating to the cloud, because let's face it, not every workload right away is suited to actually being migrated to the cloud. There are some applications and workloads that are just not ready, or just not ready in terms of compliance or audit reasons that need to be moved. So with the discovery phase, you should now have all of that information you need in order to actually answer that question. So you can put things in a column of can be migrated to the cloud and can't be migrated to the cloud. Then you can actually start to look at how you would migrate something to the cloud. Can you migrate it as a virtual machine, so using infrastructure as a service, or are you actually able to look at re-architecting that application, looking towards the PaaS or the SaaS options? Is that possible? Do the company that maybe supply that workload to you currently even have a SaaS operation or a PaaS operation that you can use and you can leverage, and it's quick and easy migration for that stage? So again, you can start to look at filtering down what your workloads look like and what they would look like in the cloud. Now, it's key here to remember that there is no right answer and there's no wrong answer in terms of how you do this migration and what you do as an organisation. Every organisation is going to be different. Everyone is going to have very different workloads, and you may have implemented those workloads differently. So everybody's strategy for moving to the cloud is going to be different. Don't think that if you go down the IaaS route with virtual machines that you have done wrong, and that's not the way you should be using the cloud. Arguably, it's not maybe the most efficient way to move to the cloud, but I know lots of organisations who have migrated to the cloud, first of all, as IaaS, in order to get themselves out of their on-premise data centre for whatever reason. And then once they get a bit more mature, once they're a bit more comfortable with the platform, they've skilled up a bit more in the cloud, they can actually start to leverage things as PaaS and SaaS solutions. They can actually start to see the path towards that much clearer because they're familiar with the platform and they've spent time getting to know it and getting to know how it works, or how that workload works within the cloud environment and what would work and what wouldn't work. So no right answer here, no wrong answer, absolutely. You also should be starting to think about how you can move these things. When can you move these workloads? Is there things that can be moved at the weekends? Are there things that can be migrated during the day? What does that strategy look like when you are actually migrating it? And start to plan out how long this would take. If all of your workloads can't be moved during the week, then there's lots of weekend work or out of hours work that needs to be done. So that may mess up your schedule slightly. You might be a longer migration stage. You might be longer at migrating this than initially you would like, because you can only do it at the weekends. So you start to think about that project plan, start to think about all of these processes and what it really looks like for you. You should also start to think about, the monitoring, the management. What does working in the cloud actually look like for you as an organisation? This is also a stage where you should start to define what success looks like for your project. When will success be actually achieved for you as an organisation and you as a project as well? Is that migrating all of your virtual machines before, say, December of the year? Is that actually migrating all of your virtual machines successfully? That could be. You might not have a success measurement that is time constrained. It could be that it's more about the success rate of the project, but define what success looks like so that you know when it's the end of the project and your bosses know when it's the end of the project and whether you have actually successfully delivered it or not. Now, as I mentioned, this is the stage where you should start to be thinking about the resource management, starting to look beyond how you migrate something and when you migrate it. Start to define and look at things like your Azure subscriptions that you'll need. What does your landing zone look like? So what does the minimum that you need to have running within Azure look like? So do you need a network subnet? Do you need VPN? Do you need a naming convention? There's lots of different things that you need to start to think about as well. Looking at who's responsible for what within the cloud, understanding your responsibility versus your vendor's responsibility. Is this a time to reshuffle how you organise your IT department? Traditionally, lots of departments split up into the operations team and the developer teams. Is this a time to start to look at building those teams together, bringing them as just one big team, and understanding the resources so that you know who's responsible for what, and if there's an outage, there isn't a name calling exercise where someone says, oh, it's their fault, it's my fault, and you really understand that process of who's responsible for what when it's in the cloud. Also looking at the consistency of your resources, like I said, a naming convention, how you deploy these resources, where you want to deploy them within Azure. There's, I think, well over 65 regions within Azure now. So which regions are you happy to deploy to? Which ones aren't you happy to deploy to? Think about that consistency. Think about setting up some of that governance and that guardrails that you might have to implement in order to stay within the compliance from an organisational point of view or from a compliance point of view as well. Now the next stage is the migrate stage, and this is where you've got the go ahead for the migration. You've done all that hard work, you've done all that investigation, you've done all of that admin type work and that planning type work. This is where you actually start to get to migrate the workloads up into the cloud as you've planned. You start to get to play and use that technology the way you envisioned. Now, as I said, this migration stage probably won't take place all at once, unless you're maybe a small organisation and you can do it all within one weekend's kind of work. But for most companies, it will take a long time, or potentially several weekends and several iterations in order to get this work done. The thing here is to make sure that you're constantly learning, you're constantly thinking about it, and there's communication plans in place. You also have to think about which workload you're going to migrate first. I always say to people, don't migrate the most important workload first, because if something goes wrong, then you're going to know about it. You're going to have your boss or your boss's boss banging on the door, shouting at you because something has went massively wrong. If you move a workload that isn't important, that is maybe just something you use within the IT department and aren't massively dependent on, and something goes wrong, you're not impacting the business. You've only impacted the IT department, and you know where that impact is. If you move your most critical workload within the organisation, which you'll have found out which is within your discovery environment, and you go wrong, you will know about it. And that's not a great exercise from your point of view, and it's not a great confidence booster for your organisation, for the cloud as a whole. So you really need to think about this. You really need to start small and build up to the most critical one. That way you can build up all the experiences that you have and actually get to the most critical workload within your environment and hopefully deliver it successfully without any issues. Now, when you do migrate, there are tools out there that can help you, and much like the tooling within the discovery environment, you have to evaluate how these tools do these workloads or do these migrations for you. And the migrations tools will depend on how you're migrating your workloads. If you're migrating your workloads as servers to virtual machines within Azure, then there's a lot of tools out there to help you. There's also tools out there that can help you migrate, say, your SQL database. There's even tools out there that can look to containerize your applications from that server that you run on-prem to a container within Azure. So there's various different tools out there, but again, evaluate them each for their own needs. How do they charge you, first of all? What mechanism do they use? How would that impact your environment? Do you need to install agents on your environment? Again, is there any network ports that need open, any access firewall? Understand what's there and pick the right one for your organisation. Try them all out, invite all the salespeople in, invite them all to showcase their tool, give you a chance to use it for free or whatever, and then understand what it is you actually need and pick the right one for your organisation. Please don't just pick the one that you think, the first salesperson that walks through the door. Make sure you're speaking to the competitors, make sure you're speaking to everybody within that environment and seeing where you can actually be more efficient by using some of these tools. Also, at this stage, you want to start to think about iterating with every workload. As I said, you'll start off with the workload at the very end of your criticality stage, the smallest workload or the least impactful workload within your environment. And as you learn from each of those migrations, then you will learn new things. You will learn how your process maybe is missing a step because something's happening wrong, and you'll be able to grow from that. So that's why I always say pick the smallest or least critical workload within your environment first of all, because you'll start to learn more, you'll start to iterate, and you'll get to refine that process. You'll also start to see where you can automate some of the workloads or some of the tasks within the migration stage. And again, if you take out some of that human error element that could potentially be in this migration stage, then you'll be a bit more successful because you're automating it. There's no error, there's no risk of someone working to 2 a.m. and being really tired and clicking the wrong button, selecting the wrong Dropbox, and having a look at that. So definitely have a look at how you can learn from each one. Have a project meeting at the end of every migration stage, understand what went wrong, what went right, how you can update your processes, how you can test further, and just again iterate and learn from each workload migration that you do. Now, the secure and manage is the last stage within your migration project, and arguably it's something that will never end for you, if I'm truly honest. It's not one of those stages that you'll be able to tick off and you'll be able to say we've completed, because it's your business as usual activity. It's how you're actually going to be working within the environment. Constantly looking at staff training. Years ago, we used to send staff on training courses for a week, a dedicated intensive course on how to operate Microsoft Exchange Server or Windows Server, and at the end of the week they were trained up and they were proficient in that tool, that operating system, whatever it may be. And we didn't have to do that again until the next operating system was released or the next tool was released. We were confident in their abilities and that was it. Unfortunately, with the cloud, it's very different. The cloud changes so rapidly and so much that you constantly have to be training. Now, whether this means that you give your staff a day a month to actually have a learning day, a dedicated time where they can block out their diary, they don't have any meetings, they don't work on anything else other than learning. They revise their skills, they look at what's happening, and they understand what's happening within the environment and understand how they can actually start to maybe use some of those new features within your environment. So staff training is something you need to plan for, you need to look at, you need to understand fully as well. You should also be looking at making sure all of your procedures and your documentations are up to date and continually stay up to date. Like I said, the cloud changes quite a bit. So if you've got a documentation where you've got screenshots or directions on how to do something and that changes one day, you need to make sure that you're constantly updating that documentation. Make that again something that is iterated maybe once a month, maybe every quarter, where that documentation and those procedures are up to date and kept up to date, because the last thing anybody enjoys is out of date documentation. Nobody really likes writing documentation, or at least in my past, I've never met anybody that likes writing documentation. However, it is something that needs to be done. You don't want to get into the state where you have really bad or out of date documentation, because again, that could lead to mistakes and errors within your deployment. Something else you need to start to think about potentially is cost management. Some teams do this right at the very start of their migration project. They implement it at the migration stage. They start to look at cost management across the whole board and make sure that that's there. Others look at it once they've migrated. Once they've got their workloads over, they start to look at the cost and how they can really optimize and save any costs and how they can manage the cost a bit better. And this is a team sport. It's not something that just the IT department should be looking at. It isn't just something that even your sysadmins should be looking at. There should be a collective responsibility across your entire organisation on how to manage these costs. Now, there are lots of things you can do within Azure to help with costs. Things like reserved instances, where you say, I'm going to be running this workload for X amount of years and I'm going to invest in it, and you pay up front for that cost, and it means that you can save some money because you've said, I'm definitely having this, so give me a bit of a discount, which is basically what a reserved instance is. There are other things like Azure Hybrid Benefit, where you can leverage your on-prem licenses and use them in the cloud, both for Windows and for Linux now. So there's lots that you can do to try and save some money, trying to implement things. You know, you could look at shutting down virtual machines. You can look at spinning them back up again. There are lots of things that you can look at once you've actually migrated, once you've started to actually use the workloads within Azure. Now, some organisations get completely stuck at this stage, and it paralyses them to a certain degree because they are so focused on trying to save some money that they forget to actually operate and start to innovate their environment. So I recommend that you should look at cost management, look at the budget, look at implementing things maybe every quarter. Have a look at what works within your environment. But I wouldn't say that this cost management is necessarily something that you need to do every week, maybe even every month, to be honest. If you set up like budget alerts, you can be alerted when things go a bit out of control, when things start to spiral out of control. But in terms of implementing cost saving measures, it's maybe more advantageous to wait several weeks so you have some legacy data to have a look at, so you can make informed decisions. If you're saying that a server is running too large, maybe for 1 week, and you look at it and then you downscale it, and then next week there's a demand for that server, you're going to have performance issues. So iterating on a week by week basis, I don't think works in terms of cost management. But again, there is no right answer and no wrong answer here. Whatever works for your organisation is the right answer. So definitely have a look at it, definitely think where that's coming from in your terms of your environment, and look forward for that. Now, this slide can often be a bit scary when I show it off, but this is drawn from thousands of engagements by our fast track team here at Microsoft, and it kind of shows that a migration is never linear and never simple. There are so many steps and so many decision points along the way that could potentially scupper or stop your migration project, or make you stop and have to do a 180 and look in the previous direction and reiterate some of your other stages. So yeah, migration projects are not the easiest to ever implement, but they are quite important, and they can bring a lot of benefits for you as well. Now, in terms of key learnings, there are some things that I want to talk about. So summarising, what does success look for your migration project? Make sure you're defining that again, so you know where your expectations are and you're driving towards that goal, and also your boss knows where you're driving towards as well, and knows whether to mark it as a successful project or a failure. So make sure you're defining that success. Involve the business at every stage along the way. As I said, this is mostly a technology project, but there's also an element of people within this project. And if you don't involve them, either from an IT department point of view or your end user point of view, there are things that are going to go wrong, and you're never going to be able to get that reputational damage back that could potentially happen. So iterate and make sure that your business are always involved at every step. Look to automate and script where you can. Take some of the human error element out of it and make things much more efficient and much more reliable when you're embarking on this as well. Choose the right tools for the job. Make sure you're evaluating the tools. Make sure you aren't just being pulled in by the sales patter that you might get from someone. Make sure you're understanding the tools and understanding the right decision points for picking the right tool. And lastly, track and optimise your spend. It is an important part of working within the cloud, so make sure you are looking at that across the board. Now, I've spoke a lot about various different things today. One thing I would recommend you go and have a look at and bookmark is the address for the Cloud Adoption Framework for Azure. The Cloud Adoption Framework for Azure is a bunch of best practices that Microsoft customers and Microsoft partners have pulled together to share for other people on their migration project. Regardless of where you are on that migration project, whether you're just starting it, whether you've actually embarked on it and you now need some help doing other projects within the cloud, there are lots of information in there. There's lots of information on things like even just their naming convention, on how to secure that and make sure that that's correct and not based on, someone's favourite movie characters, and actually makes sense for your resources. But there's lots of information in there, so definitely check that out. The Azure Architecture Centre is also something I would recommend you have a look at. It has lots of information again around best practices of architecting some workloads within Azure. So have a look at it, read up about why they've made the decision points. I believe there's some templates as well you can take to try and implement the architecture within your environment as well. So again, have a look, read about what it does, start to think about how you can architect your environment and your workloads in the cloud. Now, we also have the Azure Migration Centre, which has lots of guidance and tools and information about partners and the things that I've talked about in terms of migration. So again, another resource that you can bookmark and go back at and check throughout your journey within the migration project. Thank you so much for having me today. It's been a pleasure talking to you. All the resources and more that I talked about today are available on the link on screen. So again, do check that out. Do reach out to me if you have any questions. My contact details are on screen. So yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this session, and thank you so much again for having me today. And please do reach out if you have any questions at all.